His movement is quick and forward, a little too precise, a little too rapid. He comes toward the patron with a step a little too quick. He bends forward a little too eagerly. His voice, his eyes express an interest a little too salacious for the order of the customer. Finally, there he returns, trying to imitate in his walk the inflexible stiffness of some kind of automaton while carrying his tray with a recklessness of a tightrope walker by putting it in a perpetually unstable, perpetually broken equilibrium, which he perpetually reestablishes by a light movement of his arm and hand. All his behavior seems to us a game. He applies himself to chaining his movements as if they were mechanisms, the one regulating the other. His gestures and even his voice seem to be mechanisms. He gives himself the quickness and pitiless rapidity of things. He is playing. He is amusing himself. But what is he playing? We need not watch long before we can explain it. He is playing at being a waiter in a cafe. Hello and welcome back to At the Symposium. This week we're talking about Jean-Paul Sartre's bad faith. All right, so if you were with us last week, we talked about nothingness and negation. If you're new to this series, we're talking about Jean-Paul Sartre's being in nothingness, going chapter by chapter and getting a breakdown of what it's all about. We've made it past being. We've made it now into nothingness and negation, and even covered a little bit on angst and anguish. So just a little recap. What did we talk about in the beginning? We talked about that Sartre had two kind of modes of being, the in itself and the for itself. The in itself kind of being almost like the consciousness of an object, the for itself being like the consciousness of a human being. The for itself is a being in which it needs to discover itself, it's conscious of itself, and it's conscious of other things. Once we got into negation, now we got to figure out, how do things perceive, essentially? How do we distinguish ourselves from other things? Well, for Sartre, we do this by a process of negation, meaning that we know what we are, not knowing what we are positively, but knowing kind of what we are in a negative sense, knowing that there's negative evidence that reflects upon us what things are. So again, one of his last examples of this was Pierre in the cafe, looking for Pierre, his friend in the cafe. How does he not know he's there? How does he know he's not there? Well, he knows because not because of Pierre's absence, but because of the existence of everything else around that is not Pierre. Right? So this is kind of a negative dialectic where we see negation. Then we have nothingness, where we say, well, how does nothingness appear? Well, again, for the for itself, there can't just be nothing. Nothingness is also revealed to being. So there is being and there's nothingness. There's only nothingness because being exists. Okay? Then we start to get into anguish and angst. This is when Sartre starts going into the more existential part of his existential philosophy. So he starts to go into humans confronting all the myriad of possibilities of what they could be in the world. And for Sartre, that instantiates some kind of angst and anguish, because once someone realizes the possibilities that they have, because for him, we have to get maybe again reacquainted with the whole purpose of the philosophy of this book, of Sartre's modality. The whole philosophy here of existentialism is essentially to prove or convince people of their existential freedom. Existence precedes essence. So we have our existence and that precedes our essence. Our essence is just, it's made to be. It's for itself. It's made to be whenever we assign an essence to ourselves. But there's a way in which we can be inauthentic in that presentation for the for itself, there's an inauthentic way we could represent ourselves, and that is through bad faith. And that is what we start talking about here on page 86. What I just read for you was one of the most iconic lines, one of the most prominent examples that Sartre gives us, that's cited throughout this book, or throughout literature relating to this book, and all the pedagogy relating to this book, is the example of the person playing at being a waiter. Now, he takes this as bad faith. This is the example of bad faith. What is bad faith? Well, bad faith is basically someone lying to themselves. Okay, because again, we have all these possibilities. We're trying to figure out our essence. We want to figure out who we are, how we are. But for Sartre wants to almost get away from labels, is essentially what he's doing. Because for Sartre, everyone is in bad faith at some point. Here he's using the example of the waiter, playing at being a waiter. He says, well, this person's in bad faith because, why? Because he's not being his true authentic self. He's playing at being something. He's basically pretending, right? He's pretending to act in a role because that's what he has to do, or he thinks that he has to do that in this particular time, in this particular setting. This is bad faith for Sartre. Now, partially, why is this? Why does this fit into existentialism? Why is this such a critical theme in existentialism? It's a critical theme in existentialism because of the fact that we want to maintain this idea and notion of pure freedom. So for Sartre, bad faith, although it's something that everyone's going to encounter and struggle with, let's say, or have to interact with, he wants to get you to think of these modalities, these situations in which you might have to play a role, as not necessarily being your true authentic self, as not going forward and labeling yourself as that person or as that being that has to act in that way. Maybe that's what you're doing in that moment, but to assign the label to yourself as, oh, this is what you are, would just be too harsh. Sartre wants to keep pushing the human as an evolutionary kind of being, right? That just doesn't necessarily have a prescribed or permanent essence. And this is what bad faith is all about. I encourage you here to read a little bit about this. I'm going to have a link to the passages of this chapter. This one I'm going to keep a little bit shorter. I just wanted to cover kind of the main thrust of this topic. So from page 86 to 116, he covers bad faith, an integral part of his philosophy. That is one of the most famous, I guess, scenes or examples in this book is playing at being a waiter in bad faith. It's been extrapolated in many other examples. It's one of the most well-cited kind of things, ideas that comes out of being in nothingness is the idea of bad faith. After this, we're going to go into the for itself. Okay, so we're going to go into the for itself, and we're going to delve into that, and we're actually going to be talking a little bit too about temporality. So we're going to talk about the element of time as it relates to being as well. So still a lot more interesting things coming up in being in nothingness. Stick with us. Thanks for watching.